So with that, I'd like to welcome today's presenters. So we've got Jen Watkins and Andrew Shirk here with us today to talk about the Cascadia Partner Forum. So Jen's been the facilitator of the Cascadia Partner Forum since its inception in 2012. She works on connectivity issues and habitat restoration, with her work focused in the Central Cascades and the Cascade Mountains in the Okanagan, Wenatchee, and Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. And Andrew is a research ecologist with the University of Washington's Climate Impacts Group. He studies the interacting effects of climate change, development, and natural processes on species and their habitats, with a special focus on the demographic and genetic viability of populations, connectivity, conservation, and habitat modeling. So today, the Cascadia Partner Forum, which is a network of conservation practitioners that work in the transboundary landscape in between Washington and British Columbia, and they focus on furthering adaptation, coordination, and planning for species and ecosystems in that landscape. This group has reached a lot of accomplishments in the past years since they've been started, so we're very excited to have Jen and Andrew here today to share that with us. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the ball over to Jen, who will get us started today.
Thank you. And looking at the attendee list today, I see that I'm speaking to some people who have also been with the Cascadia Partner Forum since our inception and actually defined it and have been engaged, versus people who maybe that's the first time you're hearing about the Partner Forum. So what I'll do today is try to give a little bit of context to exactly what is the forum, where it came from, who it is that's behind it, and then the real thrust of where Andrew is going to step in and help me. Again, what I'm going to try and do is just introduce you to the Partner Forum and then have Andrew talk with me about what it is we're up to in 2018, not just where we've been, but where we're going. And ideally behind that, some of you not only get a sense about the forum, but for those of you within our region, if there's something that strikes you for wanting to engage or see an overlap or build upon that we can begin to talk about after this call, then that's a fantastic outcome for us. And so I am Jen Watkins. I work at a nonprofit organization, Conservation Northwest, focused on wildlife and connecting their habitats and recovering the populations in Washington and British Columbia. I have the honor and privilege of getting to facilitate the Partner Forum, which is a diverse body that's talking about the Cascadia region. Cascadia, if you know in the Northwest, is a term that's been used to define many landscapes. It is a profound region anchored by the Cascade Mountains that includes beautiful rivers that are known by many of us for their values, from the Fraser up in BC to the Okanagan, the Wenatchee, down in Washington. It's home to many huge communities from Seattle and Vancouver to Wenatchee and Ellensburg in Washington, as well as towns we'll talk about in BC. And so today I just want to orient you a bit to the way that we came up with a partner forum. It really is anchored in people. In 2012, a group of practitioners, those are people from nonprofits like myself, government agencies on both sides of the borders, First Nations and tribes and foundations, were coming together in a grassroots fashion for several years, just recognizing the need to think across borders, to have a regional perspective for our work when we think about the systems and the species that we're working within. And as we were coming together, we realized that we needed something more. We needed more than just an organic dialogue of coordination once a year or in random meetings and events, but that we wanted to have an actual forum that brought us together on a focused workload. So what we fostered was the Cascadia Partner Forum, and the notion was that we would continue fostering this network of practitioners that we were. We'd have what we already existed upon in a grassroots way and build off of it to get a greater network of people across land management boundaries and across political boundaries. And we would work together to build the adaptive capacity of our landscape in Cascadia and the species that live within it, a very natural resource bent for our mission while recognizing the human communities that are also depending on this landscape. And most importantly, when we formed, other than just for ourselves, there was a critical audience that we had, rather than just speaking as practitioners to each other about the priorities and solutions we see on this landscape. At the time, we had the landscape conservation cooperatives, both the North Pacific and the Great Northern, that cover the Cascadia region, that we could report out our solutions, our thinking, and our concerns about this landscape too. And so underneath this mission, we had some objectives, and one was just to really start identifying and prioritizing the science needed to guide our management on this landscape, to take the things that we are doing for adaptation to increase the resiliency of this landscape and to highlight them and discuss where the lessons learned are successes or challenges that we're facing, but start sharing lessons across this border that people are doing amazing things and we should be learning from them. The other was just to be able to facilitate communication. There is a remarkable network of scientists and conservationists and land managers that are passionate and intelligent throughout Cascadia. And if we can build the connections between them and their way to talk with each other, we expand the footprint of what we're getting done and we increase that efficiency. And the last but not least was, for this landscape that is so amazing, we wanted to be able to draw some attention to it for Cascadia. At a national and international scale, Cascadia has resources that are phenomenal, and we wanted to make sure we were highlighting that for people. And so any time that you bring people together, one of the most awkward moments after trying to come up with a mission statement is defining what do we mean by Cascadia? And this silly red box was our attempt to find a way to be anchored by a landscape. We picked two mountains, Mount Rainier on the south and Mount Truax on the north in British Columbia, that would kind of define the southern and northern reaches of what we would be centered on in Cascadia. This red box allows us to pick up most of in Washington what we refer to as the North Cascades, and in British Columbia, not only the Cascade Range, but as it breaks both east and west towards the coast and towards the inland. We pick up the Okanagan Valley on purpose, trying to pick up some of that amazing place where we leave the mountains and get down into the shrub steppe. We also pick up the Puget Sound through this map. And so we felt like this was a large enough space to foster coordination, but it was small enough to be reasonable in bringing people together without picking up the entirety of what is the Cascade Range. And the reason we even wanted a box other than bounding a bit of our discussions was it helps us look at the landscape and understand it better. We had to start learning to speak each other's acronyms and language and ways of mapping from BC to Washington, or often just across agencies from local jurisdictions to federal. And so that box let us look at the landscape better and understand what was within that box. We also were terribly mindful that a box is a fuzzy line in some ways. We need to not only think about what's within it and the critical habitat connections that are within it, but what are the Cascades connected to? And these are just two maps that we sit in a region rich in science that helps us understand habitat connections, not only within systems, but between them. And the Cascades is highly dependent on its connections to other big systems, from the Coast Range in BC to the Rockies, or southward to the outside that box, staying within the Cascade Range. And so we looked at the idea that we're not just going to talk within the box, but by topic, by critical issues, and by partnerships with other partner forums and entities, we would understand that we needed to maintain connections. And so the way we decided to do our work is we had a mission that wasn't just about bringing people together, but to increase an adaptive capacity of a landscape and its species. That's broad. That's a lot to take on. And so as we sat in 2012, we decided we needed to come up with some priority issues to narrow that focus a bit and select things we could really make a difference on. And so at the regional scale, things that we could say, we could discuss and talk about, not just building off of the local scale within watersheds or jurisdictions, but things of relevance at a regional scale. We selected a few issues that, as you'll see on this slide, our goal was to increase our knowledge about them, our coordination across boundaries, and draw attention towards. So the current issues that we have on us are access management, that issue of roads and how people access our lands, bull trout, Canada lynx, ecological connectivity, and ecological connectivity is both terrestrial and aquatic, grizzly bears, salmon, water, and wolverine. Those were all issues that lived on our list because they met a criteria of being critical in our region, having momentum and ability to think across both British Columbia and Washington when we talk about them, that we had a place and a unique value we could add to getting into those discussions. And they were also targets that were important to the landscape conservation cooperatives. And so to our end audience, we were also providing our perspective from the region of Cascadia. And it's a living list. This list is never meant to be finite. As our community grows, as we make progress on these issues, we add to it. And so this past year when we were talking with partners, 2 issues came up that we'll be adding as we look at 2018. They were critical to our community, and the first one, fire, has been an issue our landscape has focused and has affected all the other current priority issues that we have annually. So our ability to think about fire, both in the way that we understand our natural fire regimes and work with and live with it on this landscape, but also understand how it's affecting the valuable things that we think about on this landscape in real time, and how do we adjust the way that we're thinking about our conservation targets, but also in fire suppression. How do we think better about how we are fighting fires and balancing that with our conservation values on a landscape? And the second is first foods. And the first foods overlap some of the targets we've already recognized, but both First Nations and tribes have really brought to our attention, and their leadership in the way that they've done climate planning, a list of first foods that are important on the landscape. And from huckleberries to roots, we want to better understand not only where they are on the landscape and how they intersect with a lot of our conservation values and management needs, but where are the ones that are vulnerable when we think about climate and we need to be talking differently about. And so when we talk about those priority issues, I just want to give you a sense of what that means for us when we take one on. For access management, the reason it was an issue is multiple climate adaptation efforts on both sides of the border throughout Cascadia have identified that access management is a priority climate adaptation issue. To think about a resilient and sustainable Cascadia, we have to think about our road system. When you look at Cascadia, there is a daunting map you're looking at right there that was given to us by DOT data. That's actually the road footprint in Cascadia. We were surprised to see when you take in the resource roads, not just county roads and highways, roads have a tremendous footprint throughout our landscape. They provide huge value of giving us access to places, but there's challenges to their sustainability, as you see in that picture, where all too often many of our roads are sitting in areas that are not sustainable, and the impacts of climate on top of current conditions are exacerbating the problems we're finding and holding onto our road system in a sustainable way. We're experiencing floods and washouts. Additionally, this road footprint that we have has real impacts on the natural resources that we care about, both the fish and the wildlife. And so one example of what we did is, as the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest was engaging in defining their sustainable road network by national direction, they wanted to understand, as they looked at their entire system of how people access the forest through roads, how could they develop a sustainable system? They didn't have the capacity nor the time to bring in climate change as they thought about that sustainability. They had to think in current conditions. So we were able to partner with them and bring the capacity and contact the scientists we work with, both at the University of Washington, who had data on this national forest, and private scientists to bring that climate lens in. We were able to look at the road system not for its impacts to natural resources, which the forest was doing well, but where is climate actually making that road system vulnerable? There's a multitude of things that we have science on, we can project and say are causing vulnerabilities to a road system, from the soil moisture that's actually causing landslides, to the areas that were snow dominated that we anticipate will be more rain dominated, where we're getting water on those areas. And we also can look not only today, but out into the future with these projections with some certainty and think about the road system. So one thing we were able to do is call out the watersheds throughout that entire Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest, where because of our projections, we can say, in that area, you should pay attention. Your road system has greater vulnerabilities to hold on to. Talking with our end user, the National Forest, that didn't do as much as they need. They don't make decisions at the watershed scale. They make them at the road segment scale. So we had to develop a methodology with scientists and the National Forest to actually take those risks we saw at the watershed scale and translate them down to road segment by segment, which ones are the most vulnerable, so that when you're making decisions and thinking about where a road should be relocated, or if it's necessary, or if it's sustainable, you could have in mind whether or not its sustainability in light of climate should be a concern for you. That was something we can bring to the discussions of access management that are going on, is a climate lens that's not only important for this highly important watershed and national forest that sits at the headlands of Puget Sound, but it's repeatable in methodologies we can do elsewhere. Outside of just access management, you saw those other priority issues that we work on. Bull trout was one of them. There is a rich community of scientists and people thinking about climate planning for bull trout in our region. We do not need to repeat that. We simply needed to link people to that science and that planning. What we could do was think about areas where we could add value. And for bull trout, one thing we heard is that a new technology of eDNA could help people understand the presence of bull trout as they're doing their planning in their system and help us think across borders with real data. So we were able to select a transboundary watershed, the Skagit, and in support of both a local commission for that watershed and the North Pacific LCC, we were able to let them, practitioners at both BC Parks and our North Cascades National Park, utilize eDNA, collect samples throughout that system and utilize eDNA to better understand where bull trout are present, where they're present with other species, and where there may be concerns. And so rather than trying to recreate something new for a priority issue, we were just able to add value by bringing support to bringing science in a priority landscape within Cascadia. Then for 3 of our terrestrial species, the furry ones that cover large ground, wolverine, grizzly bear, and Canada lynx, the value added we could do is either bolster existing bodies that work on these species, such as the grizzly bear has standing committees that work towards its recovery and management. We could not only bolster that group by adding in some First Nations perspective and additional international participation, but we could form new groups, such as for Canada lynx, there was not a standing transboundary body to think about that management for the species. And so we formed a working group that has participation from both BC and Washington that is thinking about both the science, the monitoring, the management, and the recovery needs for that species now. And our job underneath these 3 species that we could do is we partnered with the Yakima Nation and delivered climate planning documents that actually look at the vulnerability of these species, the highest priority adaptive measures we should be taking, and recognizing where existing planning already was occurring. These are documents we've either already completed or are soon doing, and those are just documents that the experts in our region are able to create. And so for our priority issues, we try to find areas where we can add value outside of just singular species or singular processes like ecological connectivity that become a priority issue. We started to look at the need for spatial priorities on the landscape, simply finding a way to better connect people to the rich data that tells us where is important in Cascadia to be focusing your investments, where should we be looking to do restoration, conservation, or think about fostering greater coordination between values, be that with salmon and grizzly bears. In addition to just the kind of data, the raw data that sits out there, we conducted a workshop and multiple surveys to just take expert opinion that said for some of the biologists or foundations or decision makers that are on this landscape, if you just had to pick by knowledge of the area where the most important places are for you to see attention spent, where are they? We took all of this and created an inventory that sits in database and that we call our Spatial Priorities Inventory. It's a living inventory that we build off of, but it divides the Cascadia landscape data into buckets that are expert opinion so you can dig in and see why and where certain people called out their values on a landscape and why they want attention there. We have scientific analyses that are everything from habitat connectivity to where we see that we need more work done on aquatic restoration based on peer-reviewed science. We have designated areas where people have designated either politically or administratively areas that are important in Cascadia. They're not just worth noting their importance, they're often areas that you can garner greater funding to do your work if you're in that landscape. And we've put all of this into a repository that helps us better understand the landscape, helps us see where there's intersections between values and people and ability to make a difference, but it sits out there for other people to have greater access as well. And outside of working on priority issues and spatial priorities for a few years, we realized we have done a great job bringing people together around specific issues, specific species, and specific geographies. But we also need to come up with a way of evolving to look at the whole picture and with each other talk about how we can use the collaboration and network we've formed to respond at scale to climate change and begin to coordinate our vision and our actions. So we talked with scientists such as Amy Snover at the Climate Impacts Group, who helped us understand that when we think about climate change, the risks and the dangers are everywhere that we're thinking, and it's going to impact and have profound impacts throughout all of Cascadia. And we have the science to help us understand those risks and the threats, but that we needed to continue working across boundaries as we were. There's a value in thinking at regional scales, and that we needed to look at the whole picture. We talked with members of Parliament and elected officials to see if they felt that urgency and there was a value in a strategy. And we heard from Jonathan Wilkinson as one member of Parliament up in British Columbia, as well as others, that yes, there was that same need to be thinking across borders and that we need to be having these conversations, but we need to be having conversations that are linked to the policy discussions that are happening, that we're bringing the science and the needs into places where policy can help with solutions. And finally, we talked with land managers and making sure that you have a daunting thing to manage the land of your own, but do you see the need and value for a shared strategy scaled up at a regional scale? And we heard from them, like Jamie Kingsbury, who manages that Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest, that there is a need to have access to the research and science for her to make decisions about her national forest, but that we need to think big picture and we need to start speaking with one voice for the climate change impacts that are going beyond just one boundary. And so for an extremely exciting idea, I apologize, we will have 2 text-heavy slides to convey it. But what we decided was we needed to come up with a Cascadia Climate Adaptation Strategy. The strategy being something that is multi-scaled, that people can utilize at the local county scale when you're making decisions, as well as that provides that regional perspective, that it's building off of efforts and providing access to the things that already exist and giving people an easier way to connect with them while providing that regional scale. We also emphasize that in building an adaptation strategy, the process of building it is as important as any products that come from it. The relations and sharing of information and building a network is critical to what we do here in this region. And so the components of what a strategy would look like for us that we're beginning to build this year is, number 1, we have a mission statement as the Cascadia Partner Forum, but we need to start agreeing and have a shared vision for what we mean by a resilient Cascadia. What are the critical things and the components we need to see and hold on to in this region? And what is our vision for what that resilient Cascadia looks like? Currently, we have a draft vision statement out that we're putting out feelers and getting input on for the next month so that we can begin to define that vision. And if any of you would like to engage, we would love your input. Number 2, we want to have a regional spatial tool that helps us reflect this shared vision, but it allows people at that local scale that are making decisions to see how they fit within a regional framework. And Andrew is going to talk much more about that in a minute because it's an exciting piece that we're doing and we want to get feedback early on. Number 3, we want to create more and readily available access to the amazing amount of information we have. We continually heard from people on the ground when we talked about what do we need in a strategy, that they are overwhelmed with the amount of data and information that is out there, and they don't find an easy way to understand for geographies they're working in if a climate plan already existed, if there's already science that should point them in the right direction on the things they want to work on. We need to find a way to not only pull all this information together, but synthesize it and get it in the hands of people who need it in a way that feels much more accessible rather than overwhelming. And for the 4th one, we need to start doing a better job for issues of regional significance, from population growth to the way that fires are impacting our region at scales to demand a regional dialogue, that we're bringing people together, the climate scientists, the resource scientists on those issues, and the decision makers, to start thinking about what our options are on this landscape as we forecast forward. Not only thinking in real time, but Cascadia is not only going to be impacted by climate change, but how we choose to grow with our population as a region will have profound impacts on the options we've got for fish and wildlife on this landscape or our natural landscapes. People are thinking about that within Cascadia at various scales, we have got to start talking at a larger regional scale on some of those and linking that to the science of the values we want to hold on to. Similarly with fire. And so we're trying to pick just a few topics that we can begin to foster those dialogues around and forecast options into the future that will inform decision makers. And finally, we need to express the urgency behind this issue and gain support from the public and decision makers that we are out of time to not think about adaptation and that we need to be thinking about it at scale. So in doing that, we need to engage and inspire and connect the human communities that are going to be the ones doing the work out there, to not only feel like they understand the issue, that they're linked to the science and they understand the importance, but that there's something they can do about it and that their story is a part of this Cascadia story. So we need to have robust communications as much as science in this effort. And in doing all of this, we are beginning to build a team that will handle this work and a workload. But one of the more exciting pieces is this regional spatial tool that Andrew will be talking about. Andrew?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Jen. Can you hear me? Megan, is my audio good?
Yeah, you're good.
Awesome. Yeah, so again, I'm Andrew Shirk with the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, and I've been part of the Cascadia Partner Forum, and I'm leading an effort to develop a tool to identify spatial priorities in our region. Let's advance the slide. Okay, so can I advance this when I'm in the full screen mode?
You should be able to. Have you tried your keyboard?
Oh, okay, there we go.
There you go.
Oh, except it won't go back. Just a second. All right, I won't go backwards. Okay, so I'm going to start with this cartoon to illustrate how we're thinking about prioritizing our landscape to help meet our region's goals. And the focus here is conserving terrestrial species in a changing climate. Of course, we also care about aquatic species. Jen mentioned some of them. But the approach I'm going to describe here isn't really well suited to addressing aquatic species. So the premise here is that one of the primary responses of species to climate change is to shift their ranges over time to track suitable environmental conditions. And to conserve species in this dynamic environment, we really need to prioritize a connected network of both current and future habitat. And that's no small task, right? So many species ranges are shrinking due to a variety of stressors, and there are many barriers in this modern landscape that might impede range shifts. So that's a primary concern. Within this connected network of habitat, you might prioritize more central areas, outlined in blue, differently than peripheral areas. And you also might prioritize areas of overlap between current and future habitat. These areas might serve as refugia, where some species might be able to, so to speak, weather the storm. And finally, risk to species habitats might also be a consideration in spatial priorities. If you're focused on an old-growth forest-dwelling species, for example, you might consider risk of disturbances that favor young forests, things like wildfire and bark beetle outbreaks. The crux of this issue is that the scale of this network of connected habitat is bigger than any one land manager's jurisdiction. I mean, even the biggest ones in our region, the Forest Service, Crown lands in BC, the problem exceeds any one land manager. And though many of these land managers are incorporating, planning around our shared conservation targets into their land use decision making, they're not necessarily aware of this broadest scale pattern on the landscape. So we need land managers to appreciate this long-term perspective, and not just the big ones. I mean, big and small, all land managers in our region are included in our audience. We need better coordination across their boundaries so that their actions to protect this network line up in ways that support our conservation targets. And because the location of this network is likely to be very dynamic over time, I mean, it's difficult to project future habitat. We need to be adaptive. Current habitat changes in dynamic ways. we really need a regularly updated set of spatial priorities so that we can act on the latest information. And by having sort of frequent updates, we can monitor change over time. So the tool that we're building will synthesize the different aspects of this network that I just mentioned on the previous slide, not just for a single conservation target, but for a whole suite of shared targets that we collectively identify in Cascadia. And Jen mentioned some of them earlier. So the idea is that the tool will produce a single layer that reflects this ranking of our shared conservation priorities. And it will allow land managers to sort of act cooperatively at this broadest scale to conserve these spatial priority areas. So the purpose of the tool is to identify and monitor spatial priority areas within Cascadia, supporting our shared conservation targets over broad spatial and temporal scales in a changing climate. And this will provide a regional scale perspective to local land use decisions that will add new information to help land managers meet conservation targets and facilitate coordination across their boundaries. And there's several desirable qualities that we want in this tool. We have land managers of all sizes with different, technical and staff capabilities. So we want a free and easy to use interface. The whole project is going to be open source, so that it can be shared broadly and modified. A key one is that it will be collaboratively designed and built. So we're working with the end users of the tool to design it in this sort of iterative process, and so that when we're done with it, it's exactly the thing that they need to add new information to their decision-making process and help coordinate across their boundaries. To the extent possible, we want to incorporate existing methods and models. I mean, we live in a region that has a wealth of science already produced, and we want to maximize the value of those products. We absolutely need this tool to span all of Cascadia. To be comprehensive, it can't be patchy. So it has to span both sides of the border, the full study area. And the specific targets are in flux. We're still evolving what those are going to be. It's a dialogue for sure, but in many cases they're very different. The needs of different species and habitats are very different, and so the tool needs to be flexible to address a wide range of conservation targets. It needs to be frequently updated, as I mentioned, and then we also need it to be tied to automated reporting and communications capabilities. I'll talk about those more in a second. So the Partner Forum has formed a relationship with a team of engineers at Google who are helping groups like ours apply Google Earth to address conservation issues. And there's many potential benefits of this collaboration. First of all, Google has a free and easy to use interface already built, Google Earth. And underlying Google Earth is this really powerful Google Earth engine. It is a cloud computing environment that is linked to a wealth of spatial data at global scales, certainly spanning our region. You can add new data. There's massive computing power in this engine. There's tens of thousands of processors linked in parallel to solve complex spatial problems. And so this wealth of data and computing power makes running these models trivial, really. And if you build your model, your spatial priorities in sort of an automated way, it can just be run frequently and be very dynamic. There's also a capability for automated alerts and reporting in Google Earth Engine. I'll talk about these in a second too. And then finally, Google Earth has this outreach component that allows you to link sort of maps and data with text, and you can tell stories about places. And that's a key, as Jen mentioned, that's a key component of our approach. And there's a Google Earth Voyager, is sort of this 3D fly-through where you can move through a landscape and you can click on features that are highlighted and tell these sort of multimedia stories in space. So our workflow for the tool is pretty simple. The user, in this case the Cascadia Partner Forum, will specify the extent of the analysis area. There will be a set of data layers that serve as inputs that you can specify. There will be a method for combining those data layers into a sort of a single spatial priorities surface. And then for each of those individual inputs into the model, there will be a set of a separate set of parameters for each one of those, and it will depend on the nature of the input layer. And then from that model in the middle, there will be 4 different components, communications components connected to it. So there will be a viewer based on Google Earth that will allow users to interact with the models and upload their own data and look at their own unique spatial priorities relative to the model. There will be a reporting system that will, running this iteratively, our initial plan is to run it at least annually, and that gives us the capability to generate reports that quantify change. I mean, what's the area or the connectivity for these spatial priorities? How is that changing over time and space? And users will have the option to sign up for an alert system where they can define a certain geography that they're interested in. And if there is a change in the spatial priorities they care about within that geography, they can be alerted of the change. And then lastly, there's the communications component that I talked about with Google Earth Outreach and Voyager. All of these will be dynamically linked to this frequently updated model. And there's no tool that exists right now that does all these things. There's lots of tools out there, right? For designed for different purposes, but we feel like no one tool did all these things for us, and so as I said, we're going to be inclusive of the earlier efforts, but the goal is we realized we really needed kind of a new process, and this is sort of an outline of it. So our first goal is to produce a prototype of the tool, and it's going to be based really on 4 key inputs. Later on, we can add new ones, but right now it's going to be focused on landscape integrity, so areas of low human footprint, topoclimate diversity, so these are areas that are complex topographically, different aspects and slopes and elevations, that are thought to be resilient and act as refugia. Land facets, so different areas of different soil and elevation and slope, different, communities tend to be similar within a land facet, and if you conserve a certain proportion of each land facet, that's another strategy. And then connectivity, both among current areas of currently suitable habitat and also connectivity between current and future analogs given climate change scenarios. These prototype inputs that I just described have already been developed and produced by the Nature Conservancy for most of the Pacific Northwest. And these 2 reports describe their methods and results. And so we're partnering with the Nature Conservancy to sort of adopt their approach and include it in this prototype tool. And the main thing here will be to extend these models north of the border to include all of Cascadia, and also to the models that you're seeing in these reports are static. They're based on data from a certain point in time, and we're going to modify the models to be more dynamic and at least annually updated. And so I'll finish with just a little timeline here. So our goal is to have the funding and resources to complete the prototype tool by the end of the year. We currently have funding to produce the landscape integrity module, which is really the heart of the tool. But we're actively engaged to find funding for the TNC modules that I just described, to pull those in, and then produce the model outputs and link them to the viewer alerts, reports, and communications aspects. And beyond this, this year, we're planning to expand the tool to include other modules in addition to these TNC modules, these will be focused on the other conservation targets in Cascadia that we jointly identify, things like wolverine and grizzly bear and lynx that Jen talked about. And we're also building this tool in a way that could be readily applied to other geographies. So Google Earth Engine runs on the globe, so virtually any landscape is suitable. And we're going to make this tool open source and available for anyone to use. So ultimately, it will be potentially valuable beyond Cascadia. All right, with that, I'll pass it back to Jen.
Thank you, Andrew. And there is always a risk that as we presented to you the entirety of the work of the Cascadia Partner Forum, that would feel more overwhelming than sensical. The truth of the Partner Forum is it is people that came together years before 2012 and in 2012 realizing that we had a need to become something more formal and accountable to each other and guided by issues we knew we would return and work on. It's people that picked the issues that were important and that had the momentum and energy to become the priority issues that we foster the coordination around that we talked about. It's people that recognize the spatial priorities on this landscape and wanted to be more effective and efficient in their work and make connections with people outside of their silos by geography or by resource and find new connections to be more empowered on the landscape that made us look at those spatial priorities. And it is these people we're trying to unite underneath a strategy that we begin developing this year and that will be a living strategy that we keep building on, that allows us, the people of Cascadia that are participating in this open forum, to create a shared vision, to use a tool like Andrew just described that after it's a prototype, imagine being able to come back together once a year and look, did we make progress in creating a more resilient Cascadia? Did our natural areas hang on or increase? Did our connections between those natural areas expand and become restored, or are we losing options on the landscape? Our ability to have a tool to shed light and let us monitor our progress is part of that strategy. And then at the same time, taking these people and fostering dialogues not only about our priority issues, but about the regional issues that are facing us, such as population growth and fire, and building off of the dialogues already happening in Cascadia to scale them up to a regional place where we look at our options and how those issues, if we manage or make different choices, will impact the natural resource values we're holding. So while some of what we shared may seem overwhelming, it is driven by people in an open forum that have shaped our work plan to date, that breathe life into it and let us get so much done that we stand upon, and that are going to be critical to where we go from here. This is a simple slide to say we try to have a very simple structure to not have too many meetings or build off of anything more than we need to get this work done with people. We operate as a full forum with a leadership team that I facilitate that's currently being restructured, but the goal is to have 10 to 12 people that represent the different stakeholders on both sides of the border, that are the people who are crazy enough to raise their hand and just offer their time to guide this overall forum, to help us think about how we're bringing people together, how we thread all of this work together in a singular message, and how and who we should be reaching out to continue building this network. That leadership team is being restructured this year, and we're looking forward to breathing some new life into it with new agencies and participation. Underneath that, we have subgroups and teams for all those priority issues we talked about. Some of them are already standing bodies that exist that we just recognize. For connectivity, there was a transboundary connectivity working group that we were able to just recognize as addressing those issues and coordinate with when we had information needs, versus, as I said, some areas like Canada Links, we had to set up new subgroups and bodies to foster that transboundary coordination. We have a new climate strategy team that will have different work groups within it that's going to try and tackle this strategy that we're talking about, launch it, begin it, develop it, and continue reaching out to people to engage in it. And then we have the full forum, which is an open network of people that engage with us either through annual meetings that we have, like Wild Links that goes on either side of the border each year from BC to Washington, through our website, through our e-newsletter, and through just engaging with us as individuals. And so today I hope that we threaded a little bit for you, without overwhelming, of why we felt a partner forum was necessary in this region to build upon and coordinate all of the things we do here already and begin speaking at a regional scale. Why we felt it was necessary and urgent in light of not all the pressures that are already facing Cascadia, but the additional ones that we see with climate. And that we have a body of work that stretches species and processes and systems, and now a strategy where we want to share a vision with people about what a resilient Cascadia is, that invites greater engagement. And if you heard anything in there that intrigues you or you'd like to participate in, our success is wholly dependent on people participating. And so thank you for listening to Andrew and I as we ran a little bit over, and thank you for learning more about the forum.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Andrew. And as a reminder, we have all of you on mute, so if you'd like to ask any questions to either Jen or Andrew, go ahead and send them via chat to NPLCC staff, and I'm there, and I will relay those questions to our presenters. So we'll wait around just a little bit as people gather their thoughts. And then also as a reminder, we did record the webinar today, so we'll be posting that online on nplcc.org, and it'll also be on our YouTube account, and we'll make sure that everyone gets a link to that so you can share it or watch it again, and we'll also send out the presentation materials for everybody. All right, we've got a question from Lenny Young. Does the spatial priority tool have the potential to include not only shared conservation targets, but also shared economic and social well-being targets? Triple bottom line.
Yeah, I can take that one. So really what limits the ability to include any consideration, be it economic or social or ecological, it's spatial data to characterize it. So, I talked about the TNC priorities, spatial priorities models. We have spatial data that can kind of quantify landscape integrity and topoclimate diversity. The tool will be flexible to include virtually any consideration to include economic and social factors. It's just a matter of finding the data to inform those models. So I guess the short answer is yes, there's potential there, but it's limited by your ability to kind of spatially capture those factors.
And I think just to add on, Andrew, there, as we figure that out and how to add that into a tool that's simply a prototype at this time, and we learn where those layers are, we have begun adding more of those into just our spatial priorities inventory. And those are tools such as an analysis both TNC has done and the Department of Natural Resources, that when we think about our forests and where there's forest health issues or needs for restoration, areas of economic consideration brought in on those natural resources as well that light up the landscape. And so, one, we'd love to hear if people have ideas about additional data sources we can bring in, so we can bring them into the tool and our inventories as well as just our dialogues. But two, we're beginning to find some that have already integrated those in ecological analyses and are starting to add those ourselves.
Thank you. Okay, next question from Cecilia Wong. First, she says, great presentations, and asks, for the Climate Impacts Group Spatial Priorities tool, are there longer-term plans to include aquatic species as well?
So it's not the Climate Impacts Group tool. I mean, I'm part of the development of it, but it's really a tool from the Cascadia Partner Forum. And the methods, the approach I described is really not well suited for aquatic species. So we're planning a different approach for them. It's going to be separate from what I described. So no, it will not be suitable for aquatic species, at least as I've described it.
Thanks. So we don't have any questions in the queue. We'll wait for a little bit. And then, of course, if anyone thinks of any questions after the webinar is over, I think both Jen and Andy would probably be happy to answer them for you. So we'll make sure you get their contact information. Okay, another question. What are upcoming opportunities to engage on this topic with the Cascadia Partner Forum?
We have some immediate needs for engagement. One, we're currently seeking feedback on the draft vision statement of what a resilient Cascadia would look like. If you go to the website and under the strategy, we had taken surveys at a recent meeting with transboundary partners from tribes and agencies and First Nations and NGOs to begin to draft a vision statement, and we would love for it to be a statement that we all can own. And so that is certainly a first area of engagement. The second is to reach out to me directly if there's a specific priority issue or other one that's relevant to your work so that we can get you connected into the right subgroups and discussions that are ongoing and moving. And then the third is just to participate in our forum and help us understand if there are additional issues or things we should be looking at or information that we should have up on our website and resources that we can link people better to. And so take a look at our website, engage with me, and help bring some of your ideas about how we can integrate with other ongoing work or meet your needs better.
Are there any upcoming Partner Forum meetings?
We do not have a standing meeting coming. Our next one that would be an open meeting other than specific subgroups that would be meeting or the leadership team is that we're developing what it would look like to have more meetings around this strategy as we not only have a vision but start to engage people in helping us shape it. And those will likely be coming this spring. And then we do have a standing annual meeting where we develop our work plan, reflect on our progress to date, and that happens in the fall.
Thanks. So another question is does the NC data take into consideration the cross-boundary connectivity corridors work?
So what was the what data? The NC data?
North Cascades, I think.
Oh, okay. Okay. So again, the tool is in the prototype stage, and the final inputs are in flux. Right now, it's focused on the Nature Conservancy inputs that I described. Well, I barely described them, but you can read more in those reports, or we can follow up later if you want more information on that. So the effort you just described is not going to be part of the initial tool, but it very well could be in the final version. It's just a matter of collectively what sort of inputs we decide in Cascadia to include, and that's certainly on the table.
And the one thing I would add to that, just to piggyback, is that all of that wealth of information on transboundary corridors from multiple sources, including a transboundary connectivity group, is available on our website. It is in our spatial data inventory, and it is something that even when you look at this tool, if it's not already in there, is an overlay that you can bring to better understand the landscape and see how those corridors lay on the landscape. And that's the power of being able to use a Google Earth engine for the spatial tool, is that you're able to bring in and overlay other data to help understand that landscape in addition to the model that Andrew's generating.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's the spatial priorities that the tool will produce is not meant to be to supersede any other information that goes into spatial planning. It's sort of additive. So it's the broadest regional scale perspective you could have on this issue of conservation of species under climate change. And if there's more local level layers that you're actively using or want to bring in, this is meant to be sort of additive to that. And, you know, so the transboundary analysis that you were referring to in the question is not wall-to-wall Cascadia, but it could be expanded if it was deemed to be sort of that approach was something that was part of our shared regional perspective, we could expand that to be broader and include all of Cascadia.
Thanks. Next question. Can we connect to use these tools and gain guidance into other regions?
So the tool itself, the structure of it is really simple. I showed that sort of workflow flow diagram. It's basically just synthesizes some user-defined layers and links them to some communications avenues. If someone wants to use this approach in a different geography, the infrastructure will be there, the sort of the framework, but it's the trick will be those inputs that are unique to each region that are kind of summarize the shared conservation targets of that region. That's up to the region to produce, and it really depends on that region's capacity for those sorts of things. But the framework will be there, and Google Earth Engine that underlies the tool has lots of data and processing power to bring to bear virtually anywhere. So it's a big leg up, but it's not like the tool will provide information outside of Cascadia without input from that region, from other regions.
But to underscore Andrew, while he and I are both focused on this amazing landscape between Washington and British Columbia, Google's interest in partnering in this was because there is just such repeatability and value if people can stand up and not only see the need for their landscape where this could be beneficial, but bring those local inputs that Andrew's talking about. So that repeatability is part of the appeal for one of our partners who has a much more global view than our regional view.
Great. Do you guys have time for one more question?
Sure.
Sure.
All right, so it's a comment and a question. So really nice to learn that first foods are recognized as another priority for attention and action by the Cascadia Partner Forum. So do you see issues of intellectual property coming up as a potential challenge to addressing this priority? And if so, any thoughts on how to openly share info towards cooperative conservation action?
I can take that one, Andrew.
Go ahead.
I do think we will run into issues, certainly, where when we talk about data and locations and specifics of knowledge where it's beyond generalities, but we're looking at a specific first food, we are going to run into issues about what is open and what is shareable. I think we're just going to have to deal with it as it comes. I think there's ways we can get around it, and we've seen it so far with some of the wildlife species, where not only land managers, but tribes or First Nations held specific data and are able to share it, and we've reached agreements to share data for specific purposes and locked from public use, but for the purpose of collaboration. So I think there's mechanisms and tools and precedents to overcome it, but I certainly think it's something we probably will face.
Thanks, Jen. All right, so we have no more questions, so we'll go ahead and end here. And thanks again to Jen and Andrew for presenting today, and thanks for everyone who joined us. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
The leader has disconnected. This call will now end.